I don't know. I think in the summer sometimes the bad news leaps out at you even more. Maybe it's because there isn't as much news to cover. The cable news outlets and other organizations tend to concentrate even more on horrible stories. It could be that the world is always horrible, always has horrible things going on in it. But we know about them a little bit more at certain times. Or it could be that this is sort of an especially bad time. Everywhere we look, it does seem as though there's very bad stories and very sad stories, whether it's the airliner shot down over Ukraine, whether it's the violence in Gaza, or whether it's the story of this humanitarian crisis on our border. We're going to spend a lot of the show today, not all of it, but a lot of the show, talking in various ways about the humanitarian crisis on our border. Dare I call it a refugee crisis? Yes, I do. So we're going to be – so it's a little bit different from our typical Scramble. Our Monday Scramble usually kind of ranges all over the place. We'll do a little bit less of that today, stay a little bit more focused on that story. And in the second half of the show in particular, we'll focus very specifically on Connecticut's response or lack thereof to this humanitarian crisis. To what degree should we be doing more? Should we be having bigger, larger conversations than the basically zero conversations we've had so far about what we can do to at least temporarily absorb some of these refugee kids. It's a big, huge, complicated problem, and I do hope you'll bear with us. I think we're all in the middle of a learning curve. Some of us seem to be a little bit more eager to learn than others. Anyway, starting off the show today as what we call the super guest is Amanda Marcotte. She is a writer and Double X contributor for Slate Magazine, a major feeder of super guests to this show. She also writes regularly for the Daily Beast and Alternate. As we talk to Amanda, we are going to segue into a conversation about the refugee crisis and in particular the way that it sort of is depicted by some of the people who are less interested in lending a helping hand. But we're going to begin with reproductive rights. First of all, Amanda, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
And you said that one of the things you wanted to talk a little bit about is the legislative and executive moves being made around reproductive health care, although we could really add to legislative and executive judicial moves because it certainly occupied a lot of the time of the Supreme Court in the last session and not in a way that was necessarily pleasing to advocates of reproductive rights. But you're sort of going to be our guide here. So what do you want to talk about first?
Well, obviously the Supreme Court's big decision in Hobby Lobby versus Burwell has created all these ramifications in the legislature. Both Republicans and Democrats have decided to come up with bills to sort of react to it, and it's been kind of interesting. It's interesting to me that contraception, which used to be, a fairly non-controversial, normalized part of healthcare, has suddenly become this big issue like this. The Democrats wrote a bill that the Republicans filibustered that would basically allow women who work for religious right types that don't want to offer healthcare plans that cover contraception to get that contraception anyway. By going directly through their insurance company instead of through their standard insurance plan. So you would basically get like a second card in the mail that the insurance company just gave you directly to cover that. And, it seemed like a fairly straightforward compromise that the Democrats were offering, but the Republicans filibustered it anyway, basically giving your boss fairly wide powers to not only not offer a standard healthcare plan that covers contraception, but to also disallow you as an employee to go elsewhere to get it, to get contraception coverage elsewhere.
And
so that's kind of alarming.
Yeah, and some of this seems to be undergirded a little bit by a last-minute Supreme Court decision in the Wheaton case, where almost overnight the implications of the Hobby Lobby case changed, right? I mean, at the end of the Hobby Lobby case, one of the things that the court seemed to be saying is, all right, well, let's say that there are these companies that are entitled to religious exemptions, so their plans don't have to cover certain kinds of contraceptives. That means the federal government could conceivably kind of create, Concepta-Gap or something, some kind of apparatus that would then make up the difference between what the ACA specifies and what these companies can be or can't be obligated to do. And then, like a day later, they upheld this injunction in the Wheaton case. The Wheaton case basically saying, "Oh, hold on a second, because if you do that, somehow or other you are basically implicating us in this kind of contraception, which we equate with abortion, which flies in the face of our religious principles. And the courts seem to have some sympathy for that idea, too. So even if this law passed, even if the law that was filibustered passed, you wonder whether it would stand the test of court review anyway.
I think it probably would, insofar as a congressional act has a little bit more power than just simply an HHS regulation.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that was part of the fear there. So at this point, the court is so committed to just any labored reasoning, no matter how ridiculous, as long as it allows the religious right kind of wide authority to interfere with women's private decisions. Who knows what they would come up with to sort of justify it. But, that just goes to show that the compromise that the Supreme Court rolled out was offered in bad faith. They said, Alito basically argued that, and Kennedy basically argued that because women could get contraception coverage elsewhere, that either the insurance company could offer it directly or perhaps the government could step in and offer some sort of program, then it doesn't need to be offered through these health insurance plans. But then basically they said that the employer can interfere with getting that coverage elsewhere by basically refusing to fill out a simple form saying that they're not offering the coverage. So they're basically just trying to bury women in a pile of paperwork that makes it impossible to get contraception coverage unless you pay in cash.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about another bill. It's co-sponsored by Connecticut's own Senator Richard Blumenthal. This is a bill whose purpose is to stop the states from implementing laws that basically undermine their constitutionally protected right to choose. Right? It's some states have rules stipulating the exact width of an abortion clinic's hallways. There are rules requiring doctors who perform abortions to have admitting privileges at local hospitals when that's actually impossible for them to have. There are a bunch of rules like that aren't applied to other kinds of medical procedures that are roughly comparable. So this bill, if I understand it, Amanda, would basically put abortion on the same footing as pretty much everything else, that you can't make special rules for abortion that you don't make for comparable medical procedures.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes the beauty of this bill is just that it basically says that you have to have a regulatory system that regulates medicine as medicine, or, and that's it. You can't single abortion out for all these regulations. And there are a number of outpatient procedures that are very similar to a quote unquote, quote, surgical abortion that, that states could compare it to. So like a colonoscopy, a biopsy, even getting a tooth drilled at the dentist is similar in terms of risk level, and some of those are actually even more dangerous than abortion. So I think while the bill has no chance of passing, I think it helps clarify for a lot of people what's going on here. I think a lot of people see that states are passing all these laws requiring doctors to have hospital admitting privileges, or that abortion clinics have to meet ambulatory surgical centers, and they're thinking, well, that's reasonable. They need to have regulations. But if you point out that the regulations are above and beyond what, say men have to go through to get basic medical care that's similar to it, I think it helps clarify that what's going on here is they're creating regulations for the sole purpose of shutting down abortion clinics, which is not protecting women's health care, but the opposite, because, we already are seeing a surge in Texas and Louisiana and other places like that of women who are unable to access a safe legal abortion, and so they're turning to the black market to get drugs that are easy to buy that help induce abortions, particularly early in a pregnancy. Misoprostol, I think is how you pronounce it. It's an ulcer medication, but it's easy to buy on the black market.
We're going to, I just, before we shift topics here for a second, it sort of is worth sort of spending a moment with the whole question of, is that what we've come to? We think of Congress, we talk about Congress as being stalemated, as being almost incapable of doing anything. So now it's kind of come to this, that you raise bills, not that was invented in 2014, it's happened forever, but you raise bills that have no chance just so you can have the public hearing on them, just so you can, as you said, Amanda Marcotte, clarify certain issues. As opposed to being able to enact any particular remedies. I mean, this really is just now Congress is kind of in the business of educating various constituencies about whatever that particular group of Congress members think is important for them to know, even though we can't do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. I think, we shouldn't underestimate the role that politics plays in this. Democrats have had a lot of success in the past 2 electoral cycles with Republicans just saying unbelievably dumb-headed things about women's health care, women's bodies, and, bringing up a bunch of bills that won't pass but that maybe will provoke future stupid comments in public is not a bad political move on the Democrats' part. If they can get a Senate debate and a House debate about the Women's Health Protection Act, the odds of some Republican congressmen just saying something, just demonstrably false about women's bodies or abortion care and just getting into the news cycle for it is pretty high. And I have to imagine that's something that they're considering would be helpful to them. I mean, let's be clear. I think that all the senators and representatives involved in pushing for this bill very sincerely care about women's health care and women's access to abortion. But I think that they understand, too, that a lot of the news cycle is driven by, having this debate out in public, and that's the only way to kind of move the needle in the right direction at all.
All right, Amanda Marcotte, we're going to shift gears here. We are going to talk about the humanitarian crisis at the border. One thing that you've written about for Slate is the way that gets talked about, and people who, members of Congress who are opposed to doing much of anything about it, or who are openly inimical to the interests of people, young people, children trying to cross the border right now, have had a particular way that they've begun to talk about it. So let's start with Florida Representative Rich Nugent.
Listen, if you're 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, and you're coming from a country that's gang infested, particularly with, MS-13 types, that is the most aggressive of all the street gangs. When you have those types coming across the border, they're not children at that point. These kids have been brought up in a culture of thievery, a culture of murder, of rape, of all those types of things, and we're going to now infuse them into the American culture. It's just ludicrous.
All right, that's Representative Nugent on somebody's talk show. Here's Michelle Bachmann talking about a similar concern. She feels as though immigrants who are here illegally have already done some bad things. She's worried that they're going to do even more.
My heart is broken for a female college student in Minnesota who was raped, murdered, and mutilated by a foreign national who came into our country. There is an illegal alien who came into our country, and we had a school bus full of kids in Minnesota. 4 children were killed on that school bus because an illegal alien driving a van went into that school bus.
Hold on a second.
I'll tell you.
There are lines that can't be crossed.
If you want to talk about compassion,
I'm sorry, Congresswoman. There are lines that can't be crossed. Are you going to scapegoat these children?
My tears are crying for the family members
for the crime of this despicable person?
4 little children on a
and we
school
should
bus
stand
in
with
Minnesota,
those children.
and a woman,
but we should not scapegoat every one of these kids for that despicable person.
All right, let's fade that one down. I can't listen to it anymore. And lastly, the always entertaining Congressman Louis Gohmert of Texas, again, talking about his concern by the numbers. Now, keep in mind that, as we go along here today, we are going to be talking about a lot of children who are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. We have, jails in Brownsville where there are 3-year-olds in diapers being cared for by preteen girls who are also in jail. But anyway, here's Texas Representative Louis Gohmert talking about what he's worried about.
And they've committed at least 7,695 sexual assaults. You want to talk about a war on women? This administration will not defend the women of America from criminal aliens by the thousands and hundreds of thousands Well, we know thousands, and we know people are coming in by the hundreds of thousands illegally. And this administration wants to talk about other people having a war on women when they will not defend the women that are being sexually assaulted by illegal aliens in this country.
All right, so there's some complicated mathematical extrapolation going on in there, but Amanda Marcotte, you heard it. You and I may think of this border crisis as a situation in which children fleeing often very, very terrifying criminal situations, like as they encounter on the streets of Honduras, which is the highest murder rate in the world, are coming here to get away from violence. But all three of these Republicans are basically suggesting that these people are coming here to perpetrate violence. Tell me how you react to this.
It's been just like accusing immigrants of bringing disease into this country, stoking racism by claiming that whatever group that you're hating on wants to rape white women is an old and sordid tactic that bigots have basically always used. And I mean, that's what justified the lynchings of the late 19th century, early 20th century. And it's almost shocking to me to see 100 years later, we're seeing the same scaremongering being trotted out that people of color, that men of color are specifically a threat to white women, that there's some kind of racial or immigrant component to sexual assault, as opposed to it being more of a gender issue, which is what it really is. And it's frustrating because, to hear like this, particularly Representative Gohmert just go off, you would think that if we just kept all the immigrants out of this country, that somehow rape would go away. That's not how it works. There's no reason whatsoever to believe that immigrants to this country are more likely to be criminal than anybody else. There's just no evidence of that. And the fact of the matter is that like just even setting aside that most rapes are committed by somebody that the victim already knows. And what's frustrating to me is if you sincerely care about the issue of violence or sexual violence, you would be much more worried about the well-being of all these people that are so afraid of violence back home that they're willing to leave their families, leave their home country, leave whatever attachment they have to their own culture behind, to move to a brand new place where they don't know anybody, a lot of them, just out of fear of violence. And a lot of the people that are fleeing here are, like you said, children, they're women. A lot of the young girls are trying to escape sexual assault themselves. In some of these criminal gang situations, girls have very real reason to believe that they are going to sort of be forced to be a gang member's girlfriend, whether they like it or not. And the lack of compassion and the inability to see that people coming here are human is just startling to me sometimes.
I have had the same experience, particularly this weekend, having published a column in the newspaper, which basically took a very humanitarian position towards these children. I've been pretty surprised at some of the rhetoric that's been directed at me. Amanda Marcotte, it's been great to talk with you, and we do enjoy your writing in Slate. We're going to take a quick break here. When we come back, we'll talk more about the humanitarian crisis at the border. We're going to get specific about Connecticut. So far, Connecticut, at least as a state government, has indicated there's not too much that it can do. We're going to talk more about whether that's really the case. All right, we're back. Just to sort of set the scene for you, I assume most of you know, there are thousands and thousands of children from Central America crossing the border or attempting to cross the border. By one report, 52,000 unaccompanied minors are currently kind of caught in that trap, to refer to the song we went out with. There are, the president has asked for $3.7 billion to deal with this problem. Most of that money seems to be going into enforcement, more aerial patrols, more judges, that kind of thing. But some of the money will be used, at least probably, and this is one of the things we want to get into in this conversation, at least probably to help house some of these young immigrants while we figure out what to do with them. As we go along here, we do welcome your phone calls, 860-275-7266. That's 860-275-7266. And we wanted to concentrate a little bit today also on the fact that Connecticut was asked, as you may or may not know, to house 2,000 of these children temporarily at the Southbury Training School, which turns out, I think it probably is an inappropriate facility. It's just not, for a bunch of reasons, the right place. But some of us found the state's response to that request kind of curt and abrupt. Not, all right, well, maybe not Southbury, but let's sit down and kind of figure out what kind of resources we do have, how we can help. Since then, well, actually, that's getting ahead of the story. I'll let our guest tell how the story may or may not have changed since then. But anyway, it seemed as though one of the things Connecticut was not doing, at least as a state government, it was saying, all right, well, we can't help that way, but how can we help? Let's sort of see what our options are. Let's see what we've got. Let's see who we can work with publicly and privately, and see if we can form some partnerships that might help out with the plight of these children. Anyway, we have two guests today. We're going to talk a little bit more about this. We're going to start with our first guest. That is Vern Oyandel. How did I do pronouncing your name?
It's actually pretty close. My full name in English is pronounced Werner, and my last name is Oyanadel.
Oyanadel, all right. He's the executive director for the Latino and Puerto Rican Affairs Commission. I'm going to start with you because you've been kind of out in front, sort of asking the state government what it can do, whether it can do something. You've learned a little bit more about the rejection of the idea of using the Southbury Training School. But how much more have you learned? How much is either happening right now, more at a kind of one-to-one level of pairing children up with host families who are actually relatives of theirs in the state, and how much structurally is on the table, things that could actually be done that would be helpful to even more children?
Well, first of all, we want to point out to your listeners is that we were very disappointed in the state's failure to respond to this crisis that is happening at the national level. And as a result of that impression, the Commission actually met in sort of on an emergency basis to actually have a discussion about how we wanted to respond to the state. And we were given a sort of a meeting with the chief of staff of the governor Friday afternoon, actually Friday morning, and we actually brought a significant amount of stakeholders from my agency. This is sort of unusual for the work that we do, and I think it highlights and delineates the importance as to how our community felt about the failure of responding in this manner, in a positive manner, in a supportive manner to this crisis. The chief of staff sent us a letter shortly after we met with him, with Mark Ojakian, and he brought some good news to us. The decision was that they reconsidered their opinion as to not help this population, and instead they told us in writing that the administration is going to begin to help by providing support through the Department of Children and Families to those children that have a connection in Connecticut. And so for us, that was an excellent perspective of change of heart, if you will, in regards to how to respond to this crisis. The other position that the administration now has is that the OPM Secretary, Ben Barnes, will also look at other opportunities and other possibilities that may be available in Connecticut to actually have a more favorable response. And I have a meeting set up with Ben Barnes on the 24th to go over some of the other alternatives. So I'm very optimistic now that Connecticut has changed its tune, and we are headed to a more proactive approach to helping at the national level, locally, for something that is so out of the ordinary in a more humane way.
So this is really a very, very big change from, say, 4 or 5 days ago, when it was pretty much, nope, can't come to Southbury. Nice talking to you. Don't call us, we'll call you. So what changed? How did this change?
Well, I'm confident that a lot of pressure was put on the administration to actually make this change. As I understand it, Juan Candelaria, who's a state representative in the legislature, he wrote a letter to the governor and on behalf of the Black and Puerto Rican caucus to suggest that he reconsiders his opinion. Meanwhile, the Hispanic Federation also sent a statement urging him to reconsider. LAPRAC, or in the way that I actually abbreviate the words for the Latino and Puerto Rican Affairs Commission, the commission that I represent, wrote a significantly very strong letter to ask him to reconsider. So I think significant pressure was placed. I understand that Senator Blumenthal and the mayor of New Haven also had approached the governor to actually reconsider that position. And I am glad that he did. I am sure that, anybody that you talk to about this, I think all of them are going to agree that the governor's decision not to allow the feds to have temporary housing at the Southbury Training School was not the right place to host his children. So I think that nobody is going to disagree with the governor there. But we felt that there was a missed opportunity in reference to be more supportive as to maybe other alternatives that were available for the governor. And it's sort of a similar position that many other governors for other New England states actually did. Connecticut was the only state that had received a written request from the feds to actually house these children, and the other states that had not received that letter had already written letters to the feds saying, look, you may need some help, and we're here to help. And that was the same approach that we wanted the governor to take on this issue. So,
in terms of the future conversations that you're going to be having with OPM Chief Ben Barnes, who's the budget director for the Malloy administration, is it your understanding that these conversations will include conversations about potential facilities where some kind of federally directed aid and shelter could be provided to children, or is it more likely to be done on that more finely grained level of DCF working with partner families in the state?
I believe that the approach is going to be to utilize the DCF to help out children that have a connection to Connecticut. From what I understand, we've had a significant amount of parents that have contacted the DCF asking to volunteer their properties, their houses, to house these children temporarily. And so what the commissioner of DCF is probably going to do in the near future is to contact those parents and actually let them know that we may use their services and their homes to house some of these children.
By the way, as we go along here, if you have questions, if you have comments, 860-275-7266, 860-275-7266. I want to add to the conversation Glenn Formica. He's a trial and immigration attorney and a founding partner at Formica Williams. Glenn Formica, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
And maybe we could just sort of begin by talking about sort of the state of the art right now. You deal with cases where, for one reason or another, somebody needs to be put somewhere while a deportation hearing is taking place or some other process is going on. What does Connecticut do now? I mean, before we get to the whole question of the children at the border, what does Connecticut do on an average day?
Well, on an average, well, first of all, I don't know if there is an average day.
Point taken.
When it comes to children in proceedings. But right now, what happens in immigration court is that, by the time they make it to my office, they've been either reunified with a parent if the child was brought to the border, detained, and then there's a parent waiting for them here in the United States. Or they were brought to the border and a family member or friends, and they've gone through sort of down in Texas or Arizona or one of the border states, the process with HHSI, Health and Human Services, and they've been transferred into that custody. At that point, they come to me or come to the immigration court, and they're represented through that guardian in the immigration court. Now, I have had a few cases, and I've seen a few cases, and certainly many of my colleagues as well, where there is a guardian appointed through the state, through DCF, because of the child being trafficked or is abandoned, or they can't find any relatives here in the United States. So that's kind of the extent of the state's involvement with the immigration proceedings, unless, of course, and I don't want to get too technical, but unless, of course, the child is eligible for what's called a self-petition, and that's a much more detailed discussion. In some cases, the state can actually allow the child to self-petition for a green card.
Now, but if somebody has to be detained, not necessarily a child, but if somebody has to be detained, my understanding is they're typically not detained in Connecticut, right? They go to Massachusetts?
So with children, it depends because, like I said, the policy is generally to not detain children. In other words, don't have them in detention facilities. If you're speaking about adults, yes, and Connecticut no longer houses adults who are in immigration proceedings. They get transferred to either Greenfield, Mass., which is about 15 minutes from the Vermont border, about 2 hours from New Haven. And alternative to that, they're housed out in Bristol County, which is out by Cape Cod.
Just in terms of the scenario you just heard described, so the plan might be that DCF would at least initially work with the children who have a family member here in Connecticut about placing them, at least temporarily, with that family member. Maybe down the line, even if there are people who aren't related by blood to these children, but they want to help out, they want to house a child, maybe that's another weapon, another way of addressing this problem. How feasible does all of that sound to you, Glenn Formica, based on what you know about how the system works right now?
I think it's feasible. I think, and I can't really speak to the DCF aspects of it very well, but I think there's certainly challenges with these children that are coming to the border, especially the ones that are there now. My understanding of where they're coming from, it's three principal countries, right? It's El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And many of these kids are coming from some pretty traumatic situations. So, I think it's good if we can find adequate housing. I think there should probably be some thought to maybe special training for the foster parents so that they understand some of the unique aspects of fostering a child, from these countries, because I think some of them may have very traumatic experiences. They're a little different than the traumatic experiences someone from Connecticut might have, a child from Connecticut.
I want to go back to Werner Oyanedel, the Executive Director for Latino and Puerto Rican Affairs Commission. You're listening to this, but maybe we need to back up and just because for some people listening, and I know this because of the reactions that I've gotten to a column that I wrote that appeared over the last 3 or 4 days, there's a whole host of people, and they're not just in Texas, they're not just in California, they're here in Connecticut too, who are saying, why should we do anything? Why should we commit federal resources? Why do we need $3.7 billion to deal with this? Why don't we just send these children home? So, Werner Oyanedel, talk about this. What makes this situation different from a typical immigrant situation?
Well, first is that if we can think about a press conference that took place here in the legislature on July 3rd, Senator Murphy and Senator Blumenthal testified here in the legislature at a press conference that what we are seeing, if the numbers are correct, we've heard numbers between 65,000 to 90,000 children being arrested on the border alone. It would be unconscionable to actually, number one, at least in the way that they said it, to bring those children back to conditions that are inhumane right now. Children that are living in poverty conditions that are totally out of the ordinary, or that they have to go back to countries where the wars on drugs are significant. I mean, I want people to put this conversation in perspective. If you think about what a parent would have to go through in their mind to actually tell their children to go to another land, away from where they know the language, away from where they know the culture, and to be without them. Can you imagine what type of decision making you have to make to actually make that decision? Well, in my mind, if it's indeed at this level that what we're seeing here, it would be the largest refugee crisis that we have ever seen in our nation's history. I mean, I can think of the Cuban refugee crisis that took place. The numbers wouldn't even match to the numbers that we're seeing today. So when we're thinking about this, normally we tend to think about immigration or undocumented immigration or what have you. We separate that. So if we see, grown-ups coming in and crossing the border, we tend to, not be so forgiving. They're breaking some laws in one way, shape, or form. But in many times, many Americans don't feel the same way when that effect is happening to children, and that is exactly why, in my mind, this is so out of the ordinary. I am hearing a lot of conversations about whether or not we want to pay for this extra funding or not, but what would be the alternative? I mean, you still have to process these children, many of whom I'm not sure if they are going to qualify for asylum or for a refugee status. So we're talking about just the proceedings to actually deport them. So, internally I'm thinking that it would be unconscionable to actually do that. But this is the conversation that we're having here. Some of it may be solved by passing comprehensive immigration reform, but this is probably much more important, or it's a bigger conversation. We're talking about a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented numbers, and the way that we approach it is why we are we live in this country.
So, Glenn Formica, as you listen to this, obviously we're going to have children seeking asylum, and the U.S. does have asylum screening procedures that it can use. But as you listen to the administration talk, mainly as our other guest is saying, mainly they're talking about solving this through deportation, and even in asking for the $3.7 billion, they're not asking for that so that they can send these kids to Disney World. They're basically talking about beefing up enforcement and doing an awful lot of deportation, having more aerial surveillance, hiring more immigration judges and Border Patrol agents to respond to the children coming over. What is not being really contemplated is the absorption of tens of thousands of children seeking asylum here from violent situations. When you imagine this playing out, I mean, first of all, will some of these children be allowed to stay here as refugees seeking asylum? I mean, is that within the realm of possibility?
So it's in the realm of possibility if they have a pretty compelling story and they have corroboration. And, it's probably a subject for another show to go through how difficult it is to corroborate and support an asylum application. It's not as easy as just telling a good story in a straight line. I mean, having handled, literally hundreds of these, possibly even thousands over the past 15 years, I can tell you that very, very few of them ever win the first time. And, to the other part of your question, which is saying, do they have any long-term prospects of staying here in the United States? Probably not. For those kids at the border, Colin, they have really two options. One is they can either, be successful in an asylum application, or it's just a matter of time until they're sent back. Now, up until this crisis happened, what was happening, or what I was seeing, and I believe it was happening nationwide as well, was that ICE was using discretion. In other words, it was saying, okay, you're here. They would look at the totality of the circumstances, and they would make a decision as to whether to proceed with the deportation, because they could also decide, you know what, we're not going to give you a green card. We're not going to let you stay, but we're just not going to get to you right now. They weren't going to make you a priority for deportation. But what's happened since this crisis, just in the past couple of weeks, and I think it may be one of the unfortunate consequences of it, and one of the many actually, but is that now, as a policy, I don't see how the administration could use that soft discretion, because I think what the administration is concerned about is encouraging more people to send their kids to the borders, right? So they don't want to look as though if you send them, we'll keep them.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I think you will see a much more aggressive policy towards returning the kids quickly. And I think you're also going to see a policy where discretion is much more infrequently applied.
I hear you. All right. Well, let's before we go any deeper into those weeds, let's take a quick break here. When we come back, we'll talk more. Our number is 860-275-7266, and we will be back.
It's harder than hell on the border. Laying fast and breaking our backs on the border. Breaking the mold and losing control on the border.
Today's show was produced by Betsy Kaplan and me, Kyone Wolf. Our interns are Allison Ehrenreich and Lily Tyson. Greg Hill tweets for us at WNPR Colin. The part of Bill Curry was played by Ricardo Montalban. For show pages, articles, and other good things, visit our website, WNPR.org. On tomorrow's show, our panel of music mavens, Joan Holiday, Eric Danton, and Wally Lamb, will crown the Song of the Summer. And now, back to Colin.
All right, we're back. This is the Scramble. We are talking about the humanitarian crisis at the U.S. border. With us is Werner Oyanadal. He's the executive director for Latino and Puerto Rican Affairs Commission. Glenn Formica is a trial and immigration attorney and a founding partner at Formica Williams. Werner Oyanadal, you just heard the somewhat bleak picture painted by Glenn Formica of the prospects for these children. Now, we know that 100% of them basically are going back to dangerous places. We know, based on some UN studies, that 58% of them are going back to places where they've already been targeted, essentially. They've received death threats. There have been cut-up body bags left on their doorsteps. They left because they felt not just generally in physical danger, but because there was a specific threat against them. So there's something kind of mildly terrifying about the notion that they're going to go back to those places. And it does seem, and this is something that you can't start in Connecticut, but maybe it needs to start everywhere, as though the U.S. needs to be in a deeper dialogue with these Northern Triangle countries, with Salvador, with Honduras, with Guatemala, about what's happening to these kids. Because if things kind of play out the way Glenn Formica is suggesting that they probably will, a lot of kids are just going to be dumped back into these situations that they were running away from. And if that's what we're going to do, it does seem as though our government needs to be talking to their government about, what's happening there and what can be done to relieve some of the physical threat against these kids.
Well, this is a national debate as to how we need to proceed. What I am happy to hear is that we have the vice president, and I believe the president will be traveling to Central America later this week. The bilateral discussions with Mexico and with Central American countries needs to increase. If we increase the economy and stabilize that region, the number of immigrants coming in this manner is going to decrease. And and the country at the national level needs to do a better job dealing with those international questions at that level. And from what I understand, there needs to be a higher investment in informing people in Central America and North and Mexico how, even if people were to attempt to come here to see if they can catch to the comprehensive immigration reform and whether or not amnesty or other type of earned citizenship is going to be given, that even those that are coming now are not going to be eligible for that change. So we need to clearly, inform the people that very dangerous trip that they're making, just to think that there may be some type of change coming up in the short period of time, that's not going to impact them. So by having a better communications with these countries to let them know, to make some more investments so that the people know this information, I think is going to be at least one first step in actually declining that very increased influx of people from there.
Glenn Formica, you deal with this system, its rules, its laws every day. You're keenly aware of what's involved in the current crisis. Is there something we could be doing as a nation or as a state that we're not doing? Is there a relatively simple change that could be made that would take some of the pressure off this situation that we're not making?
Well, specifically off the children coming to the border, yeah, I mean, I think if they were, if, you know, as you were just discussing, if they actually made an investment in these countries to sort of help with some of the problems that are there that are sending people to the border. I know that in terms of the asylum cases that we get, in terms of the children coming across, I think that would ease considerably, as well as a public education in those countries about the fact that you can't come to the border and just, you know, expect to get in and stay, because you just can't right now. As far as easing the immigration issue at the border in general, I think there's really two easy fixes, and that's something you don't often hear when you're talking about immigration reform, easy. One of them would be to get rid of the 3- and 10-year bar, because what's happened as we've gotten, quote, tougher on immigration over the past, 2 decades, is we've actually trapped people in the United States, which may seem hard for people to understand, but the way the law is now is that if you're here and leave, you're never coming back. And so for a lot of people who may have overstayed a visa, they may have come in with the intention of only staying for a short period of time and then, leaving. They're now relatively stuck, because if they leave, they're never going to have that opportunity in the future, and they may have family ties here and so forth.
Let me quickly try to summarize that. Basically, the way I understand this law is if you stayed illegally in this country for 6 months or less, and then you go back to your home country, go back to Mexico or wherever, you can't try to come here legally for 3 years. If you stay longer than a year, you can't try to come back here for 10 years. That's more or less what it is? That's
exactly what it is. And add to that, too, Colin, that a lot of people who come in here initially, oftentimes they're invited directly or indirectly by business, right? People that need workers, oftentimes temporary workers, whether it's for farms or even for certain types of manufacture or the service industries. So they come here for those jobs, and it may not be their intention to reside here, indefinitely. And in the old days, you could just go back across the border, and then when the need came up again, you could re-enter, and that's not the case. So if they would change that law, I think a lot of the pressure, the internal pressure in terms of keeping people in the United States would ease.
All right. I want to try to grab one phone call. I'm going to pop Werner on hold for just a second. We've got David in West Hartford. Hi, David. We're almost out of time, so be as succinct as you possibly can.
Sure. My question is that with this humanitarian crisis of children, what should United States do? When you look at all the crises occurring all over the world, United States expect that other countries, for example, in Syria and things like that, that Lebanon or Jordan or all these other countries will house these refugees. But, when it really occurs in our neighborhood, we're not doing anything, but we are kind of talking about deporting them. So should we be taking care of our fair share?
I think it's a great question. We're sort of out of time. I can't really let one of the guests respond to it, but you're certainly right on target. I mean, roughly 2 million refugees, I think, have been settled in the countries around Syria. I think I read somewhere that Jordan took in more refugees in 2 days than the United States takes in immigrants over the course of a year. So, yeah, certainly in the area of Syria, part of our foreign policy says all the neighboring countries have to take refugees, and refugees numbering in the millions, whereas here in this country, we're up in arms about 52,000 unaccompanied minors. All right, we have to stop here. Thanks very much to our guests. Thanks very much to Betsy Kaplan and Kian Wolf for pulling the show together today. We'll be back tomorrow with a sunnier topic, the song of the summer.
With my immigration form, it's big enough to keep me warm when a cold wind's coming. So go where you will, as long as you think you can. You better watch out for the man. Anywhere you're going, come on and let me in. Immigration